Arthur Rothstein was a very versatile photographer. In fact, he used to say that his specialty was versatility. He had a prolific 50-year career as a photojournalist, documentary photographer, technical innovator, writer, teacher, and mentor. When this photograph was taken in April of 1936, America was in the depths of the Great Depression, the worst economic nation's history. Unemployment had peaked at about 25%, banks failed, farmers lost their farms, and industrial workers lost their jobs. My father took this picture of Oklahoma farmer Arthur Coble and his two young sons, Milton and Darrell, hustling back to their house as a dust storm kicked up the sandy soil of their desolate farm. At the time, my father was just 20 years old. He had been photographing Mr. Coble doing his chores when a dust storm approached. They said their goodbyes. The farmer and the two boys took off towards the house, and Dad ran for his car. He turned around and saw this as he waved goodbye. Dad always left the last frame on each roll of film for emergencies. Good thing, too, because this shot was the last frame on that roll of film. This is by far Arthur Rothstein's most famous photograph. It was the most widely reproduced photograph of the 20th century, and it's in museums around the world, and it became an iconic symbol of the Great Depression. If you're wondering why a 20-year-old Jewish kid from the Bronx was driving around the Dust Bowl taking pictures in 1936, I'm going to tell you the whole story. Arthur Rothstein on the left was the oldest of three sons born to European Jewish immigrants in 1915 in New York City. So Arthur was a first-generation American. Around the turn of the 20th century, Arthur's parents were forced to leave their homes because of government-sanctioned anti-Jewish pogroms. They found tolerance and hope in America. Much of the rest of their large family perished in the Holocaust. Dad had always been aware of his family's many sacrifices, and he was drawn to the stories of immigrants and the dispossessed, people who had to relocate due to forces beyond their control. In the Jewish tradition of Tikkun Olam, he used his camera to bring attention to problems in society, taking social action in the pursuit of social justice, doing what he could to help repair the world. Dad received a camera from his uncle when he was 12. This uncle taught Arthur how to use the camera and how to process film. They built a darkroom together. Arthur honed his skills by taking pictures of his relatives. He used his new camera to take this picture of his uncle by matchlight. Arthur was a gifted student. At 15, he graduated from Stuyvesant High School and entered Columbia University, where he founded the University Camera Club and was photo editor of the campus newspaper and the yearbook. Here's a picture of the Columbia University Camera Club members sitting on the newly opened George Washington Bridge over the Hudson River. During college, Arthur earned extra money making photocopies. There was no such thing as a copy machine back then. If you wanted a copy of an image or a document, you had to take a picture of it with a camera and process the film and make prints in a darkroom. He hired himself out to make photocopies for various scholarly projects at Columbia. That's how Arthur met Roy Stryker, a Columbia faculty member who needed photocopies for a book project. President Roosevelt designed many New Deal agencies to help lift the country out of the Great Depression. Stryker became Director of Public Information at the Resettlement Administration, a New Deal agency that aided farmers through loans, education, and relocation. Stryker, seen here with Dad, believed that photographs would provide indisputable visual evidence that Americans needed assistance from their government. He believed that photographs had the power to change men's minds. Stryker hired my father to set up the photo unit. This was in July of 1935. Arthur Rothstein was the first photographer hired by Stryker. Over the 8 years of the program, 17 photographers would shoot for the photo unit, including 5 women. Dad described the photographers this way. He said, "As a group, the FSA photographers affected each other, but preserved their individuality. Roy Stryker made us all aware of the need to understand the subject and to tell the story in visual terms. The photographers not only created works of art, they produced meaningful, factual communications," end quote. Here is a map of the United States as it was in the 30s, showing the range of resettlement administration projects that Stryker and his team were promoting. Congressional opponents of the president questioned the need for the resettlement administration programs. Roy Stryker used all the tools of persuasion, including illustrated newspaper and magazine articles, to inform the American people and help convince Congress that hundreds of thousands of dispossessed farm families were in desperate need of government assistance. Photographs taken by this photo unit were available at no cost, and as a result, the pictures were widely used. Despite his excellent education, Arthur had not traveled outside of the New York City area. For this new job, he would have to become a self-sufficient young man. He was a city kid and only learned to drive when he got hired in Washington. He spent much of the next 5 years driving around the United States on photo assignments that might last for weeks and months. In addition to several cameras, Dad traveled with a light meter, a film processing kit, a tripod, flash bulbs, and lots of film. He had a sleeping bag in his car because he often slept there. There were no interstate highways back then, and Dad often drove down dirt roads. So he had an axe to chop down trees that got in the way. He had a shovel to dig his way out when he got stuck in the snow or in the mud. He had a percolator to make coffee, and he had a Coleman stove to cook on. Meanwhile, the stock market crash of 1929 wiped out millions of investors. Consumer spending and investment dropped. Failing companies laid off workers. The photo unit fanned out across the country to document these hard times. In doing so, they introduced America to Americans. Wherever you lived, life was tough. This is a closed bank in Haverhill, Iowa. Dad took a lot of pictures of failed banks. This is a bank that failed in Kansas in 1936. The name of this photograph is Waiting for Better Times. Jay Huffman of Grassy Butte, North Dakota, sits in front of his closed store, 1936. Notice the signage. Dad often used signs, graffiti, and billboards to make a more effective image. This is a pool hall in Culp, Illinois. Again, signage adds so much information to this picture of a grocery store in Salem, Illinois. The title of this photograph is Unemployed, Key West, Florida, 1938. Besides the signage, notice the portrait of FDR. People showed their support for the New Deal agenda by displaying the president's picture. Here's a shoeshine man in New York City waiting for his next customer. Read the quote by Robert Disraeli. It really helps tell the story. It says, "The secret of success in life is for a man to be ready for his opportunity when it comes." In the fall of 1935, Stryker gave Arthur one of his first big assignments. In the hills of Virginia, hundreds of families were being relocated out of what would soon become Shenandoah National Park, the first national park in the eastern United States. In the park, high up in isolated mountain hollows, families were living in primitive conditions. In Shenandoah, Arthur would create a picture story illustrating a way of life that would soon be gone forever. The federal government constructed clusters of homes in the foothills just below the park for the displaced farm families. The displacement and relocation of families from Shenandoah National Park was covered by newspapers and magazines across the country. Here's another of my father's picture stories that was picked up in the press. In Missouri, over 1,000 tenant farmers were forced off the land they had worked for generations. The landowners discovered that it was cheaper to hire day workers or lease a tractor than it was to have sharecroppers living and working on their land. In protest, the tenant farmers demonstrated along 100 miles of state highway. Entire families were camped out for weeks along the highway. The Missouri State Police had been forcing families to move away from the highway. Picture stories that appeared in newspapers throughout the country caught the attention of First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, and she prompted FDR to act on the sharecroppers' behalf. After the president intervened, the protesting tenant farmers were given grant assistance, and some were moved into resettlement housing. Roy Stryker was an academic. My dad said that he ran the photo unit like a college seminar. He made sure that his photographers were well informed and prepared for each of their assignments. For instance, if Dad was going to shoot in an area where cotton was grown, he was expected to read all about cotton production in J. Russell Smith's Encyclopedia, North America. Each of the photographers traveled with a copy of this book. Arthur was expected to read up on the social aspects of the cotton industry, including child labor. He was expected to understand the history and the culture of cotton growing, including the plantation system. The photographers' research made them better visual storytellers. The photo unit moved from the Resettlement Administration to the Farm Security Administration, or FSA, in 1937. Thereafter, the photographers were known as the FSA Photo Unit. Arthur Rothstein's picture stories of rehabilitation clients celebrate the success of government programs. Here's Ernest W. Kirk Jr. with a team of mules, which was bought with an FSA loan. He's in Colorado. And here's the son of a sheep rancher who was a government loan recipient, and this guy was in Idaho. Howard Crowder's daughter playing with a litter of pigs. This was in Colorado in 1939. And here's Thomas Beatty, resettlement client. Here's Wayne Beatty, Tom's son, exhibiting his champion rooster. And here's Tom Beatty's youngest daughter getting a ride. Looks like Arthur created a comprehensive picture story of a farm family when he visited the Beattys at the Western Slope Farms in Colorado in 1939. The FSA photographers introduced Americans to the Tennessee Valley Authority, or TVA, projects, which provided flood control. They built dams that brought electricity to hundreds of thousands and provided economic development by hiring an enormous number of people. Here are some of the 1,300 men in the 7 a.m. to 3 p.m. shift at the Fort Loudon Dam project. The TVA brought rural electrification to farms, which helped modernize society as well as the economy. Meet Mrs. Robert Bacon, farm wife, with some of her electric appliances. She's got a fan, electric press, and a radio. These previously unemployed farmers are laying track near Douglas Dam in Tennessee. These jackhammer operators are building the Douglas Dam in Tennessee. An electric refrigerator helps Mrs. Case keep her eggs fresh. in Lauderhill County, Alabama. Extreme weather conditions greatly contributed to the length and severity of the Great Depression. In some parts of the country, there were devastating floods. There was widespread and persistent drought throughout the Midwest, especially in the Great Plains. The worst of it was in an area centered in the Texas and Oklahoma panhandles. This was an area called the Dust Bowl, and this was the center of the Dust Bowl. It was very flat and it was very windy. In the Dust Bowl area, the deeply rooted prairie grass had kept the rich topsoil in place for thousands of years, and during the 1920s and 1930s, it was plowed under. The soil was churned with gang plows, like this one, to plant vast fields of wheat. In the rush to plant wheat, almost no attempt was made to prevent soil erosion. And ranchers allowed marginal lands to be overgrazed by cattle and sheep. Overgrazing also caused erosion. This is what erosion can do to a farm. The combination of significant drought, strong winds, and erosion produced black blizzards. They were dust storms that carried millions of tons of stinging, blinding dirt. Enormous black clouds of dust, dirt, and sand swept across the Great Plains. The title of this photograph is Dust Storm over the Panhandle and the Town of Amarillo, Texas, 1936. That car is being chased by a giant dust storm. Farmers couldn't farm. All the topsoil was blown away. Dirt would swirl through the air, making it difficult to breathe, making people sick, suffocating people with dust pneumonia. Farm animals had no grass to graze on. They also had trouble breathing. If the drought and the dust storms weren't bad enough, hordes of insects would often descend to eat what was left of the withering crops. All that was left for many of the families of the Great Plains were failed crops, repossessed farms, and the very real possibility of starvation. So there was this epic ecological disaster taking place in the Great Plains, our nation's wheat belt. After each dust storm, farms were buried in sand and dust. Thousands of ruined farmers and ranchers had no choice but to sell or abandon their land and starving livestock. Many relocated in search of greener pastures. Amazingly, some farmers stayed behind and prayed for rain. Stryker often provided shooting scripts, and he told his photographers, while you're out there, get a portrait of what life is really like. And if you read this, you can see a check outline for photo documentation. It says, on the street, don't forget, you need to get the stores and the theaters and the churches. He explains all the things that need to be photographed during an assignment. Arthur's photographs showed the conditions in farming communities. They visually described why farmers needed loans from the federal government. This town was abandoned because of crop failures. Stryker expanded his photographer's mission and focus. Now he wanted them to create a portrait of America and a national historical record. When FSA photographers went out into the field on assignment, they did not just photograph drought conditions and government relief projects. They began to photograph everything about life all over America. Arthur documented people suffering and celebrating. This is a high school marching band in Butte, Montana in 1939. I think it's interesting to note that the 1930s was a turning point in the history of photography. Cameras became much smaller and lighter, therefore more portable, making it easier for photojournalists to do their job. See how Arthur has two cameras around his neck? He's holding a 35mm camera, and the other camera is the Super Iconta B with its square 2¼ by 2¼ inch film format. He took his famous dust storm picture with that camera. Arthur was depending more and more on 35mm cameras. They enabled him to quickly capture intimate scenes, like this Cuban-American cigar maker in Key West, Florida, or this young bean picker in Maryland, this child laborer picking potatoes in Colorado, or this girl picking cranberries in New Jersey. New Deal legislation significantly reduced child labor in many industries under the National Industrial Recovery Act. However, the protections did not extend to agricultural workers. In farm communities, all hands worked. Here's Pete Seeger singing to Inspire at a National Youth Organization event in 1940. Roosevelt's New Deal government enthusiastically supported unions and union organizing. These are wives of farm laborites in Kansas in 1936. Strike pickets in New York City in 1937. A proud steelworker in Midland, Pennsylvania in 1938. Union organizer working to better conditions for all TIF miners in Missouri in 1939. The Resettlement Administration helped many farmers keep their farms. In this photograph, a grateful farmer and his son thank the president for their drought relief farm loan. Sadly, many other farm families had no choice but to pack up their meager belongings and go. This family was forced to move by drought from a farm near Dickinson, North Dakota in 1936. All across the Midwest, farm families pulled up stakes and relocated in search of work. They were forced to leave their homes because of drought and bank foreclosure. Hundreds of thousands left the Central and Great Plains states. Many headed west to California, Washington, and Oregon. This is Vernon Evans. He and his family left their grasshopper-ridden failed farm in South Dakota and hoped to make Oregon in time for hops picking season. John Steinbeck's Pulitzer Prize-winning novel, The Grapes of Wrath, was published in 1939, and the movie version was released in 1940. It's a story about the Jodes, a poor family of tenant farmers who migrated to California. Dad photographed real uprooted families across America who, like the fictional Jodes in John Steinbeck's novel, were living in dangerous, unsanitary conditions. They were driven by poverty and the hope of opportunity. This family had migrated from Tennessee to Florida to find work in a fruit canning plant. They were unable to find housing. Only the government, the Resettlement Administration, could help them. The Jode family may have been fictional, but their poverty, their squalid living conditions, shared by over 300,000 farm families, was very real. Recent research has confirmed that my dad's photographs inspired John Steinbeck's creativity. The fictional Jodes found respite in a government-run weed patch camp. That was the name of it, modeled on an actual FSA camp for migrant workers. The FSA developed sanitary camps along major highways. The government-run sanitary camps provided migrating families with clean and safe temporary homes where they could wash their clothes, take a shower, see a doctor. Food was provided in exchange for community service. My dad's photographs were used to show how government funds were used to help desperate families. The pictures also dispelled any rumors that the camps were havens for troublemakers or anarchists. By this time, Arthur Rothstein had become a seasoned documentary photographer and an expert visual storyteller. He had a deep understanding of the fear and uncertainty faced by displaced people. His photographs provide us with a rare glimpse of the human drama that took place in much of America during the 1930s. Arthur drove all over the country. Each assignment would cover several states and often last for months. This gas station was on the Colorado-Wyoming state line in 1940. Dad traveled throughout the Western United States too. He loved the West so much that he published a book titled The American West, Photographs by Arthur Rothstein. This is lovely, isn't it? Cowboys relaxing in the bunkhouse at the Quarter Circle U Ranch in Montana. Cowboy life seemed very exotic to a kid from the Bronx. Dad's trips to the West resulted in a lifelong affection for cowboy culture. After 5 years on the road taking pictures for the federal government, Dad was exhausted. In April of 1940, he took a job as staff photographer for Look magazine in his hometown, New York City. Stories in Look always had a strong emphasis on photographs. Dad had not lost his social conscience when he went to work for Look. His new position gave him the opportunity to create picture stories that brought important issues to light, including race relations. This picture story highlighted the indignities of daily life suffered by a young Black man living in the South. As America geared up for the Second World War in the early 40s, the photo unit of the Farm Security Administration was merged into the Office of War Information, or OWI, a propaganda machine used to help boost national morale and the war effort. Dad left Look magazine and returned to the photo unit. This is a World War II defense bond display at Grand Central Terminal in New York City in 1942. It incorporates Arthur's photographs to create an emotional impact on the public. Under OWI, Dad and the other FSA photographers were tasked with creating picture stories like this one, which shows the happy family of a defense plant worker living in housing provided by Reynolds Aluminum. He reassured Americans that our boys would win the war. In this picture, the sergeant is teaching his recruits how to salute. Roy Stryker made sure that his photographer's body of work would be preserved. The file was moved to the Library of Congress in 1944. It is considered to be a national treasure. All the photographs in the collection are in the public domain. They form a comprehensive pictorial record of American life between 1935 and 1944. This is a recent photograph of an actual file drawer in the reading room of the Prints and Photographs Division at the Library of Congress. If you can't get there in person, you can go online and access many of the images in the collection. After his time with Roy Stryker, Arthur Rothstein went on to enjoy a long career, which I'd love to tell you about another time. But this is where I'm going to end this presentation.